My name is Jonathan Anderson. I'm Assistant Professor of Art here at Biola University, and I'm joined today by Dr. Matthew Milliner, who's Assistant Professor of Art History at Wheaton College. He earned his Master's of Divinity at Princeton's Theological Seminary, and then went on to earn the MA and PhD at Princeton University in Art History, which enables you to speak across disciplinary lines in a wonderfully refreshing.
So I hope. So I hope. Long time in Princeton, though, to get. But it's a nice town to live in for a while.
He's widely published in a number of journals, both popular and academic. And recently, last year, was appointed to the Curatorial Advisory Board at the U.S. Senate, through the U.S. Senate. And it's just really good to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah. Thank you, John.
And we're going to talk today for a period of time about the art discourse. And I want to begin our conversation today by putting two quotes out on the table, two articles that I know you're familiar with and have referred to in your own writing. And these were both written about 10 years ago. The first was published in January 2005 by Stanley Fish. He wrote this in the Chronicle of Higher Education, quote, "When Jacques Derrida died, I was called by a reporter who wanted to know what would succeed high theory and the triumvirate of race, gender, and class as the center of intellectual energy in the academy. I answered like a shot, religion. Announce a course with religion in the title, you'll have an overflow population. Announce a lecture or a panel on religion in our time, and you'll have to hire a larger hall," end quote. Mm-hmm. So that's 2005. A year and a half earlier, and I think Fish is talking about academia in general. Mm-hmm. A year and a half earlier, to choose one essay among others, in 2003, Sally Promi published an essay in the Art Bulletin arguing that the scholarship of American art history, in particular, was experiencing and should in fact welcome a religious turn. Yeah. Or rather, she put it, a return of religion, is how she framed it.
As if it ever went away. Yeah.
Yes, right. Yes, there's several assumptions built into that.
People continue to believe through this eclipse of interest in the matter by academics, right? So it's, anyway, yeah, exactly. But she's fully aware of that in the article. It's quite good, yeah.
Yeah. And perhaps we can address what does it mean if there's a return, if people have believed through. Well, and that's what I want to talk about today. From our position, about 10 years after both of these were published, what does this look like? What has unfolded since these essays were published? Has there been a religious return or return of religion? How has that unfolded from your experience?
Yeah, first of all, I have to, it came to my mind all of a sudden that one of the maybe top 10 Onion headlines, Jacques Derrida dies after his death. They put the death in scare quotes, as it never comes to mind every time you hear that phrase. But I think the way I put that together is I try to rewind. They're oft quoted. Everyone suggests, hey, I mean, specifically Fish. It's like, oh, look, and this is wonderful. The red carpet has been rolled out. We're all welcome back into the barren secular halls. And of course, it's a complicated story. And I'd like to pan out the camera a little bit and give a quote, not from 10 years ago, but from the 70s. And this one by Max Mueller, an anthropologist, is particularly appropriate, just to counter and to flesh out the discourse. Quote, Mueller says, "Every day, every week, every month, every quarter, the most widely read journals seem just now to vie with each other in telling us that the time for religion is past, that faith is a hallucination or an infantile disease, that the gods have at last been found out and exploded," end quote. So that's from the 70s, the 1870s. Just to really recede back there and just get the sense, at one point, there was a situation in which there was residual religion, but if anybody was serious, if you really buckled down and did the hardcore academic reading, you would discover it's all a lie, it's all a hoax. And I think now the situation has reversed. There is a residual secularism, But if you really are serious, if you really do the reading, if you buckle down and actually bother to engage Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, or Brad Gregory's The Unintended Reformation, or Thomas Fow's incredible book, Minding the Modern, you say, wow, they've been found out. Shall we say, the secular gods have at last been found out and exploded. And I really think that's where we are to a certain extent. As I've read reviews of these grand narratives, and it's a narrative game, that's what's happening. Because secularism was a narrative game. It was, hey, religion kind of began, arced, crested, and stopped. And here we are. If you grow up, if you're a man come of age, here you are. You realize you gotta just be in a world without God. And you have echoes of that, of course, all the way through the 1950s and into the 70s, and even, of course, today in an assertive way, because, in a certain sense, there's some trepidation about what's really going on. One of my experiences is picking up a academic journal and reading Martin Jay, Downcast Eyes, wonderful meditation on ocular sensation and the way that corresponds with French theory, and it doesn't correspond well. And he basically is faced with these books that are just coming out by the pound of religion, and it was in the context of a review of the secular age. And essentially, he's like, look, he says, making one's way through this thicket of new interpretation and appreciation is not easy, especially for those of us who remain religiously unmusical, to borrow Max Weber's still felicitous phrase. He's like, what happened? That's not how I was trained. What is all this stuff? He almost reluctantly quotes Yanni Vattimo, the breakdown of the philosophical prohibition of religion is a sign of our time. And so that's where we are to a certain extent. And the question is, how are we going to navigate this new opportunity, this new window? What's funny to me is when you see reviews of these massive publications that boiled, when you really read them, okay, what really is your problem with, for example, Dr. Gregory's book, How dare he be Catholic in the academy? And that's what it comes into. Really, wait, so you're saying you shouldn't be allowed to do this. You're appealing to expired regulations. And so that's really where we are to a certain extent, I believe. And again, the fact that sometimes people, but wait, look, there's a secular department of religion that was, there was a department of secularism that was founded at a given university last year. Isn't that problematic? And I say, of course it's not problematic. It used to be that the entire university was a department of secularism. And now they've been narrowed down to one particular department because maybe they feel a little bit on the run. And, we've still got to study this phenomenon objectively, just like people used to. Let's study this curious phenomenon of religion objectively. So those are a couple of ways I've helped myself around this territory, and I'm excited about it. But of course, there's a lot of temptations with the new opportunity as well. Most importantly, the temptation to Schadenfreude of like, we're now going to reassert ours, and that of course is deeply irreligious. That perspective, which concerns me. I identify a little bit of it in myself, and it's a real dangerous position. We've got to be careful not to be as unwelcome to the secular perspective as the secular perspective was once unwelcome to believers. So just some thoughts. I don't know.
Yeah, so I want to pursue that line a bit further of the response, how to act in this space. I think before we get into that, I want to sort out a bit further what is that space right now. To try before we get to response, what are the contours of post-secularity, if that's where we are, and what is contributing? If it's an issue of narratives, how we tell the narratives of art history, for instance, why is it breaking down the secular narrative? And how is it breaking down? What are the major challenges to it?
I think one of the reasons I think it is breaking down, and of course it has not completely broken down. It's a diverse world, the academy, so you can have varying points of view, and that's the whole idea of it. But the hegemony of the secular perspective has broken down. I remember Diogenes Allen, a wonderful Rhodes Scholar and Princeton Seminary professor and philosopher, who described his experience at Princeton in the 1950s, undergraduate. And he said the priest kind of gathered us together and said, like the 5 students on campus who actually believed in God. And of course, there probably were more, but it was, again, the pressure was serious. And I wasn't there, but he's describing this, and he said, and the priest looks out at us and says, okay, folks, kind of like a football coach after a merciless third quarter. It's like, we're taking a beating out there. I mean, and the priest himself was saying this is like, just like, what are we going to do? And it was someone who had that long range. Diogenes Allen died recently, so he has this long career to have the looking back about it. He actually told stories that when he was young, he said, oh, I'd like to be a police officer. And his professor, or teacher, elementary school teacher at that point, just put her hand on his shoulder. Oh, you won't be able to be, because by the time you're old, there won't be crime. And she was dead serious. And that is what is broken down, the progressivist naivete, that we're moving toward this time where religion, every time you develop some rational capacity, you're going to have to give up on that. And we don't need to rehearse the various sociologists like Peter Berger who've just simply done a public about face, or Harvey Cox on this issue. Like, what? Like, I didn't expect myself to think otherwise, but I've realized that that's wrong. And so that may be another way to navigate and understand that situation, I hope. And it's something that I experienced, and I was told, interestingly enough, and maybe not wrongfully, beware secular humanism, and that's what they're going to do to you out there when you get into the big bad secular university. And yet, lo and behold, I got there and I said, well, where is it? I mean, I see little pockets of it here and there, and I see and encounter some serious resistance, but I've also found that the kind of resistance I've experienced welcomes a pushback, and that's called dialogue. It's really nice, we should try it. And so there's this sense of, there's a glasnost that's sort of happening, a perestroika, a thawing of the secular ice. And that means there's a lot of water around, that means that there's a lot of confusion, that means there are a lot of people like Martin Jay who are frustrated that they have not been equipped for this situation. And again, Martin Jay's brilliant, I'm not suggesting that he can't handle it, but he, by his own admission, said, what do I do with all this? And so again, just more ways maybe inhabiting this environment, which can be overplayed. But again, to go back to my experience, I was told, going to schools that were professed in their Christian commitment, that's what it's like out there. Because in some senses, the news was a little bit expired, because it was from back when Diogenes Allen was being told, oh no, they're coming to get you. And so that narrative continued. And in some senses, we are perpetuating it. We, that is to say, in Christian institutions who are pointing out there and saying, uh-oh, be careful. It's like, well, update your data and say, there's some incredible opportunities that are going on.
Yeah. And I've been struck by not only is there incredible opportunity in the sense of the discussion being wide open. I think I'm experiencing this especially in the arts. That there's just it's wide open. Whatever you want to talk about, if you can do it interestingly, there aren't kind of built-in prohibitions about that. And that causes
that's a good point.
That causes me to think, on the one hand, that Christians re-engaging that space really need to be wary of the kind of self-aggrandizing martyr complex and
here's my chance,
the excluded hero or something.
Finally, I have returned. Yeah. That's right.
And which always operates on straw men of secularity and of the secular institutions. So that's on the one hand. I think on the other, I'm very much struck by how diverse that conversation is, that open conversation. That religion appears to be back on the table for discussion in the arts, but it's taking a lot of different forms, and it goes by a lot of different names, and is coming from really different perspectives. How does that look from your position within art history? What are some of those?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I don't mean to speak too personally, but unfortunately, I can give you a personal story about being a little bit too aggressive or taking this opportunity in the wrong way, and that's my own initial approach to this. I remember reading discovering, like kind of, I'd like to say, I think it was before it was being talked about a lot, I found James Elkin's book on the strange place of religion in contemporary art, and I read it, and I was like, what? Like, I mean, he's actually he's doing crits with the students saying, you're not allowed to have non-ironic religious art in the contemporary art world. You just can't do it. And I was so offended at this. I'm like, what are you saying? Like, and there was and I wrote it kind of and then I experienced some gallery moments. This was back when the Chapel of Sacred Mirrors by Alex Gray, this kind of New Age center, was in Chelsea, that's since moved out to somewhere in New York State. And I remember going and seeing these neo-pagan events and just being like, what is going on? And I wrote this kind of, what I thought was relatively funny, but at the same time, overly negative review where I said, look, this is, come on, Elkins, what's going on? Why are you doing this? And he wrote a very kind and genuine response to it. And he said, look, I'm not enforcing it. I'm just saying this is what's going on, and I want to equip my student. Now, what's interesting, the reason I point that out is because I saw this and I realized, why are these prohibitions continuing? But he has continued this conversation. Mm-hmm. And I picked up a recent book that he has an essay in called Idle Anxiety is the name of the book, and the essay is Iconoclasm and the Sublime. And he says this because, of course, the conversation continues. Because he's not where he was when he originally wrote the book. Quote, these excellent scholars of religion who are themselves religious and value their scholarship principally as a way to enrich their religious experience have shown me a different way of reading art history, end quote. Now, what he's talking about is his experiences at Biola and coming out and being welcomed, not by the guy who's like, what are you doing? But by the person who's, well, let's have a conversation about it, and coming out repeatedly. And that has changed his perspective. And so I'm thrilled and delighted that there weren't just people approaching it the way I was approaching it, but there are people who had a more mature perspective that could move in this direction. And I've also come to realize, and I learned this from a mutual friend of ours, Dan Seidel, it's like you don't want the gallery to ape church. It operates on its own rules, and those rules aren't necessarily excluding God as much as they are simply historically determined aesthetic criteria that are a result of essentially a post-18th century phenomenon known as art that didn't quite exist before. And those rules are not the rules of the church and vice versa. So learn to play by those. And I think that's where I had to come to understand it. So, well, it's okay if there are certain restrictions within the contemporary art world, even as the express prohibition of anything sincerely religious may in fact be receding. And so that's the interesting territory, is that if a person can learn to ask those questions in that language, what a wonderful gift that they can offer both people who have no religious interest and those who are religious, who can walk out of their confessional boundaries and experience something because, of course, they know God. The same God is present in those experiences. And in some senses, navigate that intermediate zone. And so that's, I think, maybe a couple of different angles on the way that is played in regard to contemporary art. But again, it's not to say that there's not a hostile residual secularism coming from some scholars who just don't have time. And in the same essay where he praises the people that he has encountered who are themselves religious, he also points out, and then there are people who just still continue to just not have an ear for this kind of thing and just could care less, and really, almost in this naive way, think that, religion is just this big illusion and it's all daddy issues, as if they are unaware of Paul Vitz, the psychology professor at NYU, who completely turned the tables and said, oh, you're an atheist. Oh, let's talk about your daddy issues. And he just goes through case by case and over again and shows that there are some deeply psychological problems with a lot of the most famous atheists. And he points out at the same time, well, I'm not suggesting that disproves atheism. I'm just saying be careful, because that's a two-way street. And so, again, I think a lot of it is just this residual ignorance. Because if people who resist any religious interest whatsoever continue to resist it, have they actually engaged the new scholarship that's come along, or have they just been like, ugh, don't know what to do with that? And once someone does engage it, whether or not they are religious, that's when things get interesting, because it, again, creates this table at which different parties can come along and say, okay, can we now kind of look back upon the history of art? And that's the thing about the history of art. The history of art has been so infused with this secularism that there are multitudes of scholars who have no profession of faith that I am aware of, who have done everything they can to cast off the shackles of the secular perspective, simply because it is not illuminating the data. Mm-hmm. If you have a Burkhardian take on the Renaissance that says that this was all the beginning of the focus on detailed reality, without the angel and the nimbus and the wings depicted, is clearly the move toward the secular, is just a genuinely naive perspective. And so now that we get rid of that, you can say, as many have said, actually the more detailed a Northern Renaissance artist got, the more physical reality was saturated with symbolic meaning, because, of course, as Christians, they didn't see a difference between the spiritual and they saw a distinction between the spiritual and the physical, but they merged in the incarnation. And so that is particularly apparent in Renaissance art, the way that has shifted. Modernism has been recast as an ancient Christian aesthetic revival. Because in 1913, when the Armory Show hit this country, just as significant was the 1913 Russian Icon Show, in which Andrei Rublev's Trinity was uncovered with all the soot from generations of veneration that had covered it. And that is what Henri Matisse had seen. And that is what Alfred Barr Jr., founder of the MoMA, had seen and said, oh. And so, I mean, that just, those two insights right there, that the Renaissance is not necessarily secular and that modernism is in some respects a Byzantine revival, just, I mean, we've got to rewrite the whole bag.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's fascinating. I mean, you point out with Renaissance, the Burkhardt or whoever, there's an interpretive problem that reinforces and produces and reinforces secular interpretation, secular discourse. I'm really interested in James Elkins, and I have really benefited from his work a lot, because I think he makes a very similar observation about contemporary artwork. So I think like his book is set up in such a way that it's look at how people are making work that has religious significance, and there's no space to talk about it. There aren't interpretive categories.
He laments the fact.
Yeah. Right. He ends his book on a lament.
Yeah, but the interpretive categories are there. They just haven't been engaged.
Yes. And that's the issue. And I think that's part of his broader project of challenging historical narratives. Exactly. And one of those that he challenges them in general, but one of them I think is specifically this, in a still predominantly religious society, or at least significantly religious society, we don't have interpretive space, at least in the academic discourse, to talk about the religious significance of artwork.
And I think the good news in that regard, you're right, we don't have the interpretive space, but it's not that it has to be written, it just has to be read.
Yes, right.
And this is where the triumvirate, Jacques Maritain, Pavel Florensky, and John Ruskin, Maritain Catholic, and of course his wife Raisa was deeply influential as well, the poet, and Florensky, an Orthodox martyr, shot by the very people who were really excited about that October Revolution initially, as of course it calcified into something egregious. It might be unfair to suggest that, but maybe not. And finally, Ruskin, who was, I remember walking around Rhodes and speaking with one of my professors, so there we were kind of surrounded by these environments, and I just kind of scratched the surface of Ruskin, and of course you scratch it and it just keeps going down and down and down and down and down. And I just said to him, I said, he's a really respected Renaissance architectural historian. I said, why? Why has Ruskin not been assigned? Why has he not been discussed? Why in the one essay where he does show up in the grad school reader to art history is he utterly, in some senses, eviscerated for no particular reason? And just, how dare he, again, be an evangelical, which is what he was and remained. We know that now, thanks to Michael Wheeler's incredible book, Ruskin's God. But anyway, I asked him, why hasn't Ruskin showed up? And he said, because he didn't write German. And German is the native language of the discipline of art history. And that's where the serious stuff happened. But here you have this native English-speaking, brilliant art historian, the first one at Oxford, and slash art critic. I don't know if we want to call it art history per se, but it certainly functioned that way to an extent, but it was so passionate. It was so postmodern in the sense of not aesthetic contemplation in the Roger Fry, Clement Greenberg sense, but in the engagement of politics and art, which is, of course, what has returned to the history of art, but it's a Ruskinian insight at the beginning. And I think another reason is not just that he didn't write in German, but it's because he wasn't serious about his Christian faith, and it saturates everything that he wrote, and it is the first layer of art criticism in the 19th century in this country, through the crayon, through these other journals. And this is obvious and clear if you actually bother to go before the great generation of Germans who come and remake the discipline in the 40s in this country, like Erwin Panofsky and others. I'm interested in that earlier layer. And so he's one example, and then I should just briefly mention Maritain and Florensky. Of course, Florensky's writings are literally suppressed. They do not appear in Russian for a long time, and then they finally have, thanks to the heroic translation work of two scholars, they've come to the fore. And we realize, wow, one of the most brilliant art historians of the 20th century, who anticipated Panofsky's insights in many respects, has just now surfaced, and he was an Orthodox priest, and he was brilliant enough to survive under the Soviet regime with his priest's cassock on, because they couldn't kill him because he was too smart and too valuable. We have the great story of Trotsky pointing to who's that guy in the lab? Oh, that's Pavel Florensky. Well, why does he have a cassock on? Doesn't he know what happened to this country? And well, you know, he can do it. And Trotsky says, hey, Pavel, why don't you come to the conference and give a paper? But don't wear that. And Pavel's like, oh, I'll be wearing this. And he says, okay, you can do it. I mean, it's amazing, this extraordinary individual who emerges in this secular context and makes the great case for icons, and in some senses blows Freudian psychoanalytical art theory out of the water, which is with his interpretation of the materialized dream. And then, of course, Jacques Maritain, who another career to be celebrated, who's relatively ahead of the game in being rediscovered and redeployed. But all of the missteps of secular art theory are avoided in Maritain, because he doesn't make art do the metaphysical work. He realizes that, no, you know, enchantment is not the job of art. The job of art is to uncover the enchantment that's already there, that God put there. And art's not that powerful. And in some senses, strangely enough, it is in Maritain's deeply Thomist perspective that art can do most of the work, because it's not overburdened with the need to sacralize the world. It can tease out the sacred that's already within because of the glory that God embedded within it, as the Psalms tell us. So, I mean, those three folks, it's all there, but they're just not assigned. In fact, if they even are assigned, sometimes they're just deliberately misread. Oh, see, they must just be who knows what, and then they'll just be dismissed. You're like, come on, read them. Seriously. I don't know.
I mean, do you think part of that may have to do with the faith commitments of those three? Perhaps what they're drawing attention to, Aquinas, patristic father, the patristic sources.
It takes a lot of reading to understand those folks, doesn't it? You want to say, but you don't want to do that reading, do you? I understand. Well, therefore, don't dismiss it. You know. Yeah.
And it strikes me also that those three specifically, beauty plays a central role for all of them, and beauty has been a really, understandably, a difficult issue in 20th century. I wonder if that has something to do. It's not just prohibition of religion, religious thought, or even the sources they're drawing from, but the centerpiece, in some sense, doesn't make sense, or hasn't made sense until the last couple decades.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that we need to point out that there's a kind of beauty that is condemnable, and there is a kind of beauty that should be pursued at all costs, because it is life and meaning. And the former is the kind of beauty that shows up in the film 12 Years a Slave, where there's a horrible injustice that happens inside the house, and a slave is just beaten. And then to patch over that injustice, the master says, keep playing. And the slave just, he's playing. And that is the beauty that is unjust. That is the beauty that patches over the horrific reality that we are faced with. But there's another beauty, and that is the beauty that you see later in the film, where he doesn't want to sing. He's in utter servitude, and he is bitter. But then he hears the slave song coming up, and then it just bubbles up within him, this cry for justice, and he starts to sing. That's the beauty that we should be after, the beauty that comes from the depths of reality, not the fake beauty, the human glory, as the Gospel of John puts it, the doxa ton anthropon, that is a, in some sense, distraction from actual reality. That's the beauty of Times Square. That's the beauty of the optocracy, to use a Byzantine art historian's interesting word, that surround us, that tries to manipulate us with its advertisements. And so, faced with that kind of polarity, it's like, okay, if I get to define the terms, yes, we need to be about beauty, but not about that beauty. When the false beauty, well, in that case, you might even pursue ugliness as a antidote to it. Faced with someone who is always anesthetized by reality through a cheap surface beauty, give them a little ugliness to it. Okay, I want to get to the core of reality as it is. The danger in contemporary art, from my perspective, and I get this, I think, to a certain extent from Jacques Maritain, the danger is, yes, you can find a lot of ugliness in contemporary art, and you can say, oh, see, look, they're just doing what Milliner's saying, they're just cutting the surface. I'm not so sure. I think sometimes the ugliness is suggesting, no, you see, at the core of reality, it's all ugly. There's no meaning, it's all nothingness at the end. And I am brave enough in this art gallery to point out, yes, indeed, it's all just disgusting at the core of reality, and maybe it's not even worthy of that adjective, it's just a void. And I think that we've got to tame that and say, okay, this is here, and it can be employed in an aesthetic practice to a certain extent. It's very dangerous and powerful, but use it as a tool to break down the surface beauty. But it's actually false to suggest that the reality as we know it is ugly at its core, because from a perspective of faith, reality at its core is, as God says in Hebrews, good. And it is so fascinating that the word in Greek, of course it's not originally in Greek, but the Septuagint translation, so influential, kalos, right, good. Just add one little lambda and you have kalos, beauty, which calls you in its core, because as Pseudo-Dionysius points out, that wonderful conflation of those two words, kalos and kalein, means that beauty is summoning you towards something grander. And that something, of course, we know is God. That's what Jacques Maritain is suggesting. And he's saying that if the artist is only satisfied with that surface beauty, and interestingly enough, taking the aesthetic fashion of the day, the temptation is there to not try very hard. Oh, I'm just doing what everyone else is doing. But if the artist really penetrates reality to its core and keeps digging, they might find themselves having to avail themselves of new styles or even invent a new one to get at reality, which at its core is beautiful. And that evil layer, that is itself a corruption. This is what the difficulty with Michel Foucault is interesting as it is, his pointing out that power is behind everything. It's true to a certain extent, but if you pierce that level and deconstruct power itself, the undeconstructible element in Foucault's thought, I think you get to the glory, the doxa, at the core of reality, that itself does weird things to power. We call that the cross, which for John is the revelation of his glory, right? So all of this is exciting because I think it gives us the tools, Maritain's perspective, which can easily be embraced by differing traditions, I think. It gives us the tools to embrace ugliness where it's important, and it sometimes is. Birgitta of Sweden, this wonderful saint sometimes called Bridget of Sweden, she says, you must pursue ugliness rather than beauty. You must. Because of the temptation to worldly glory. But the same Birgitta could talk about the Christ child radiating life. And then the next breath talk about the hideous deformed face of Jesus. His mouth sagged open, the blood came down on the side, and his feet were nailed together, and his body was being infected with... she goes into great detail because she could do both. That's a Christian aesthetic, going in both directions. And all of that is there in Maritain, Florensky, and Ruskin. But again, it's like, so the theoretical frameworks are there. They're just, let's engage them.
Yeah. Well, and it strikes me with much contemporary practice, the whole interpretive mode is attending to how art has a social function. It's social dynamic, what it does in a group of people, in a society, and so there is some other work than we could probably see how discussions of beauty, if they appear only in that frame of thinking, in a kind of social history, a sociology of art, really, you can see how it would be, well, it just gets turned to power, or it just gets interpreted in those terms.
It's just that little film over injustice.
Whereas your discussions, or Maritain discussions, of drilling to the core of reality, and that's about the world. Contemporary art, arguably, at least the interpretation of it, is about social relationships, and that I think that's an enduring impasse that I've witnessed very often.
And that's what's so curious about Ruskin, is that he, of course, was, all of it is infused with justice. The reason he's interested in Gothic is because it can counter the evils of the Industrial Revolution. And so we've come full circle, and this is Herbert Kessler's insight, a Byzantine art historian. He's like, well, with the recovery of the contextual in postmodern art history, apart from the modernist, isolated, disinterested contemplator, stroking his goatee in front of the beautiful painting. Well, now that we have this reinfusion, well, then, in some senses, it was invented by Ruskin because he's seeing the need for justice, but he's doing it impelled, like Millet was impelled by his Christian commitments, to care, to look into the dignity that is being overlooked. So,
I want to talk a bit about enchantment. You brought up that word earlier, and the project of, or I suppose the narrative that might be one way of describing post-secularity, the narrative from enchantment to disenchantment to re-enchantment is the language. And it seems like there are a lot of ways that is being presented. I've read a number of things that are re-enchantment is this, comes out of this yearning for deeply secular people to avoid the coldness and sterility of a disenchanted world. And so we need an enchanted world. That doesn't necessarily mean God. It doesn't necessarily mean a turn towards theology or religion. How have you seen that discussion playing out? Should this is a sort of crude way of asking, but how should Christians think about re-enchantment, the project of re-enchantment?
I think that we should be skeptical, because art cannot do that. That's a stark way of putting it. But it really cannot if it's not connecting to a higher, hate to use that phrase, higher power, but I'll use it.
Deeper power?
There we go. Because it's right, it's become a
primordial.
cliche. It's connecting to something that actually, someone who can actually enchant, and that is who believers believe in, is that there's, and in some senses, there's somebody on the other side doing the enchanting, and your job as an artist is to connect with that, as opposed to trying to gussy it up from midair. And I think that's what we can call the injustice card. Oh, so faced with all of the evil around you, you're going to make something enchanting? It's like, is that going to be enough? And so I think this is one of Maritain's warnings, is art cannot do the metaphysical work that it wants to do. And therefore, you need to be allied to a system that is weighted with that responsibility. And thankfully, art doesn't have it. And that's what I mean. It's like, to go back to that analogy of drilling down to the core of reality, enchantment sounds to me like a magic wand. Like, there we go. Okay, it's all enchanted now, until it fades the next morning and you wake up with a hangover, and then you deal with reality as is. But what I'm describing is more like the hard work of drill into the core of reality, and then you encounter something that is staring back at you, that is the goodness of the world, that is indeed still good. even though it has fallen from the Christian perspective. The good gone bad, not the good versus bad, as Lewis puts it, to distinguish Judaism, Christianity from Manichaeanism. And so that it's like the enchantment project again. It's just like beauty. What do you mean by it? And I think the world already is enchanted, and maybe that's not even the word to describe it. It's just and that's what beauty is trying to get at, the same reality. Being itself is an infinite mystery. It is this wonder that we are faced with that we, as children, understood, but as we get older, we learn to necessarily forget in order to navigate and traffic in the goods that we need to survive. And art at its best restores that childlike faith and vision in reality. And we all know that when you walk into a new art exhibition, or you see a painting and you say, oh, it's like it's like Chesterton says, right? We make fairy tales about apples that are golden to remember the first time when we learned they were green. And that's what art does, or what it should do, but it's not doing it of its own power. It's kind of like a merely subjective view of the sacrament. And again, art is not the sacrament. It's always important to point that out. As Alan Jacobs reminded me once, necessarily, it's so important to hear this, is that God has promised that he will be present in the Eucharist and in the Word, but he has not so promised about art. You might get it here and there. So it's, in a sense, but it nevertheless, at the same time, is maybe, to use the Catholic term, a sacramental, which isn't a sacrament, but it's in the vestibule. It can help you restore that understanding. And what a gift it is, which is why we welcome it into the church, to restore that sense of vision and wonder that we originally had. And in some senses, that is why we need to be open to new possibilities and new styles, with the expectation that they will probably fail. They won't impart that wonder because it's hard to do that. But also to be open, and when you see a conflation, and I don't mean to embarrass you, but I think of this in your work, bringing these different irreconcilable styles together, the cocktail that, I see, now I see an abstraction and realism fused, and I can walk out and see things freshly. I don't know if that's enchantment as much as drilling down to see what things really are. And I'm actually suspicious of enchantment, because enchantment might be the kind of thing that enables the slave to continue to play the violin as the injustice goes on. I want the art that comes up from within. And it's easy to perceive in music. And it's certainly there in art as well. I mean, you just look at, the way you look in front of certain paintings, yes, that person was doing the work. I think of course, sadly enough, tragically becoming a cliche, that Van Gogh's paintings, he was digging hard. And you look at the Group of Seven, the astonishing canvases in Toronto at the Mike Wolk collection and at the AGO that you can go witness, and you just say, oh yeah, these people got it. As if Cézanne lived for another 4 decades and came to North America and unpacked the glory of the wilderness. And there they are, right? We've got it, and so yeah. Drill into the core. There we go. We're keeping going back. We should have a prop jackhammer in here to.
Yeah. Well, I suppose one of the challenges that could come from within Christian circles to the language of drilling to the core would be the discussions of the surrounding shalom. What is art for? What is beauty really about for us? It's not so much about the way things are. It's not a kind of metaphysics of things. There's not necessarily a core that is accessible or accessed. It's more about relationship between things being in states of shalom or disorder or whatever. I don't perceive you in that camp, but how do you feel about it?
Well, this is exciting because as I've tried to read in Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant perspectives on this issue, I've collected these quotes, I've thrown them together, but without reading them off, I'll simply suggest that I have found in Etienne Gilson, another kind of companion of Maritain, a little bit at odds, but nevertheless wonderful work. Francesca Murphy's book on him is extraordinary. So he at one point says, art at its best is not just telling us how reality is, but how it will be. And I found something very similar in Protestant work. N.T. Wright says this exactly when he's talking about his view on aesthetics. We're painting what is to come. And of course, this is the great divorce when the painter is in hell and he's trying to be coaxed into heaven, where the person who's trying to convince him to be ontologically dense enough to actually inhabit heaven. He's like, you're obsessed with your art. Don't you see that your best canvases were painting this place? But no, he had get lost in the solipsistic nightmare of his own artistic pursuits. What a disaster, right? But he was really at his best painting heaven, what the new heavens and new earth would be. And then finally, I've seen the same thing, of course, in Orthodox circles, interestingly, of course, with this, a few moments here and there where there's this eschatological understanding. And the best way, and so in other words, you put all these together, each of these traditions has had a moment where there's the sense of, yes, creation's not done yet, and it's en route to something, and it has a telos. And the best way I can describe this is that Joel Sheasley, whose Giverny is Lincoln Marsh and Wheaton, that is, just like Monet found a swamp and made it the most beautiful thing imaginable, because it was, and we didn't see it, we would just pass it and say a swamp. So Joel Sheasley, my colleague at Wheaton, goes to this marsh in Wheaton and is there 6 a.m. every day and just drilling to the core. And one time in a deep, deep religious faith, serious Christian perspective on the world. And he looks at him, he was trying to describe what he was doing, because I'm very interested in it. And he says, because N.T. Wright came, and I think he got some of those ideas, and he said, yeah, I'm painting the future. And his eyes lit up, and I'm like, exactly, right? He gets it. And I mean, it sounds so, in some sense, almost sentimental when it comes from my lips, but I assure you it had depth when it came from his, who's out there every day. And creation has a destiny, it has a future. And that, in some senses, keeps us from the static grasping of reality, because reality is not static. It's going somewhere. It's in participating in a God who is himself not static. And so how could this creation that bears the footprints of his being to a certain extent, and it's not equivalent, of course, to his being, but that's Bonaventure's term, the footprints, in a certain sense. How could it be, in some sense, a still pond? No, it's a rushing river. And it's kind of exciting that you see that possibility emerge. And I feel like the postmodern aesthetics at its maybe peak in, I guess, the 80s, and maybe at its best was trying to recover that. Yeah. And let's re-dynamize and refuse everything with some level of enervation. And of course, this is home turf for a Christian perspective on reality.
And gives a different set of resources for a social reading of art, if it's about
if things have been coagulated into injustice, well then break that off, just blow it apart and then move and keep things moving.
Perhaps one further question here. We've talked a bit prior to this conversation about one of the maybe ongoing sources of resistance to the return of religion in the discourse of art and art history is the notion of the avant-garde, and that there's this persistent attempt to preserve the avant-garde or reinvent it. It's this ephemeral, it always has to be avant.
Yeah, because it keeps getting compromised.
Right, yeah.
It keeps attempting to be, I think in some senses the predicament of the avant-garde was this, here's society, let's distance ourselves from it. There's this wonderful quote from Matisse in the 1950s where he looks at the flood of images from advertising that surround us, which are, to the eyes, what prejudice is to the intelligence. And in that context, he called for painting to be something different. And a great Matisse is that, is it not? Of course, he started to work on chapels at the end of his life, too. There's a wonderful documentary that chronicles his relationship with a commission by a nun for one of these. Nevertheless, he had this sense of art being outside and critiquing society. But of course, I think, short explanation of what we have with pop art is the throwing oneself into that reality and saying, wow, I'm sick of trying to distance myself from it. Why can't I be complicit in it to a certain extent and celebrate consumerism? And you might suggest, oh, but you see the pop artists, they were trying to draw the market reality into the cult of high art. And that might be a fair assessment, but might be actually an overly charitable one. In fact, they were embracing consumerism. And so you have this predicament, this every time we move ahead in critiquing a consumerist society, the brilliance of consumerism managed to gobble up art. And of course, you just think of the price tags on certain images created by contemporary artists today, and you say it's the most egregious example of capitalism run amok. And of course, how could you call that I like to think, I remember going to these shows in Chelsea and seeing this fight the power shows, and just after Obama was elected, when there was a pulses of elation through the contemporary art community. Yes, we finally have our guy. Well, there was one person brave enough, an African-American artist, who did this wonderful kind of epics in pencil, these graphite works of magnificent detail that had a picture of Obama. It said, "Black capitalism is still capitalism." And he seemed to have this no, I still want to fight this. I don't care if we've got somebody who we might trust. I don't know if I trust him. And there was something consistent about that, and I was impressed by that. And then I walked out, and I saw the Maserati dealership across the street. And I said, what a curious place to choose to protest capitalism. And then, of course, you walk down a couple of blocks, and you see a Hispanic Pentecostal church, and you say, now that is an avant-garde that is embedded in this skyrocketing real estate of Chelsea, who's saying, no, we're going to continue to be for justice here because of the Lord whom we believe in. And so I look at that, and that story has been played out in the discourse of the avant-garde, the discourse that happens in very high sectors of the academic world by relatively well-paid, well-fed professors, of which, sadly, I must admit complicity in that regard. But nevertheless, it's like, what a curious place to make these accusations. And what's interesting is Georges Bataille at least had the honesty to realize in the early 20th century as an atheist that, if you really want to model for the avant-garde resistance, you look to the early church, because they were successful and they undid the Roman Empire. And I remember reading that and being stunned. I read it in some leftist journal, and I was like, wow, he's looking to the early church. Because, of course, the Desert Fathers were just that. And I remember sitting in a lecture at Princeton about the Dada. And I had a brilliant young undergraduate who ended up becoming a Rhodes Scholar next to me, who was a serious believer. And he was listening to these lectures about Hugo Ball, one of the founders of the Dada. And he said, I'm going to do my project on this. And he started to do the project, and then he said to me the next day in the lecture, he's like, you realize Hugo Ball gave up on the Dada and returned to Catholicism? And I said, no, I didn't know that. I didn't hear that in the lecture. He's like, oh yeah, look it up. And I started to look it up, and I said, for goodness sakes, it's true. Hugo Ball said, okay, I started this movement, and I don't think it's going to work. And you know what he did, curiously enough? Just like Georges Bataille understood, but of course Hugo Ball at this point from his Christian faith, he started to write he started to write studies about Byzantine saints, 3 Byzantine lives, that is, desert fathers who were the most radical performance artists of all, who fought the compromise of Christianity with their ascetic practices that make anything Marina Abramovich does look pretty tame in comparison, or the most daring performance artists of all. These guys were serious about critiquing not just the compromise of the world in general, but Christian compromise. And they saw the complicity of Christianity in consumerism and capitalism. It's funny, we were talking about secularism, and as we went out to the famous In-N-Out Burger, which I got to go to the first time, I was pretty excited about it. You pointed out to me, you said, hey look, John 3:16 is right under there. And you say, oh, this is in some sense everything that's wonderful about evangelicalism, getting the message out there and blanketing the world with this truth of the gospel, and I love it. But on the other hand, it's also problematic, because what happens to the truth of that verse when it is something that I'm going to and then toss away? And you can see in some sense the need for the avant-garde, this secular resistance to, and again, I love the burger. Please understand, I'm not saying that the whole enterprise should be shut down. I am not saying that. But I am saying it is problematic when I toss this away. And maybe you could suggest, this is about as charitable as I can get toward the secular art critic, and about as self-flagellating as I can get toward my own tradition. Maybe the reason the avant-garde was necessary because of Christian compromise. Because we were not bearing witness sufficiently, because we didn't have enough desert fathers out there and desert mothers who were giving up everything because they simply heard the gospel that, you know what it says? It says, give up everything. And so they went off and did that. And maybe if we had more of that, if we pursued our religious lives such that I would be a beacon of holiness through my own witness to the gospel, then I would have that critique of this incredibly aggressive consumerist world that is all around us. Traditional, old school Christianity does a wonderful job of critiquing society and giving us our distance from it. I think this is, in some senses, the theological charism of Stanley Hauerwas, what he has brought. It's like, hey, let the world, be the church. Yes, you can go too far in that regard, and it needs to be nuanced. But that is a message for the hour. And what if we have this conversation and kind of the veil is lifted and we realize all truth in the end, and we say, oh, as C.S. Lewis says, will happen in heaven because, we finally understand. And what if we realize, I had to send the avant-garde because you guys were messing up. And so, yes, it didn't work. But you should have picked up the slack. And so maybe that's one way to think about it, is what I've learned is, having been pretty aggressive in graduate school, about my Christian perspective and putting up my dukes when necessary. I feel like that was not necessarily the best strategy. I should have been the first to line up to point out the places where Christianity had failed, because I should specialize in repentance as a believer. And I think that's very important, is that we need, and this is where Ephraim Radner's work has been so important to me, is that we need to honestly admit, we should have done more. We should have done more. Please forgive us. And that is a message that doesn't have to be this ham-handed, we don't have anything to say. We do. But it's not about us. It's about the faithfulness of the one whom we serve, who is the image of the invisible God, which is the aesthetic warrant for everything.
And that's a pretty reorienting perspective, if that's what the return of religion means.
Yeah.
I mean, it does look like it casts some critical eye towards the church, and it casts some affirming eye towards the avant-garde. It causes the whole thing to need to be reread to some extent.
There's something to be said for that. It's kind of emerged in this conversation. I'm surprised by it myself. I'm like, that does make sense. In other words, it's like, hey, now that we have a seat at the table again, this post-secular glasnost and everything is thawed. And, you haven't talked to us for a couple decades. Here are a couple of things we did wrong.
Yeah.
Instead of, we're going to control it now, we're going to retake the ivies for Christ. Yeah. I mean, that's it. It's. I appreciate, but this is, of course, what James Davison Hunter is after in his book To Change the World. Be careful, because we didn't do that good of a job with him. And again, of course, that easily translates into just this porridge of nothing significant, and that's not what we're suggesting. I think it's about living the witness, not just giving the witness.
I mean, one of the things that I keep returning to is that the return of religion in contemporary art, or whatever, contemporary art discourse, seems to be ultimately a pushing towards a return of theology.
Yeah.
That it's not religion that's as interesting or as concrete, because under religion comes in, all of the sorts of re-enchantment, and
Yeah.
really all of those things keep pushing back towards how do you interpret the world? How do you interpret what it is to be human in the world? And those are ultimately theological questions, not religious questions. And if it's theology that is the primary actor, if that's really what's at issue, not theology in terms of doctrinal bullet points, but theology in terms of interpreting the world in the face of God, under the face of God, or perhaps under the absence of the face of God. God is in the interpretive frame, at any rate, is the interpretive frame. If that's really what's at issue, a kind of return towards theology, or that's the question that's being begged. They're theological questions. Then that does just force us back to the post-secular table, if it's a post-secular table, differently, so that there's theological significance in Dada and in the Avant-garde.
It's
and
apophatic,
and there are tremendous theological problems in much of the evangelical art that's being made at the same time.
It's the surface beauty.
That's right. So we're not working with necessarily, are you religious or not? It's a question of what kind of world is this artwork working in,
and you've got to hit the weights to learn that theological language
right.
and break yourself in and understand that it's like learning a foreign language, and you need to be able to communicate in that in order to make some of these claims that we're talking about. And critical theory, in some senses, was an attempt to be theological. And that's why I love how when David Hart was talking about continental philosophy, he said, well, no theologian has the right to dismiss continental philosophy, just like no father has the right to abandon his children, because we gave birth to it to a certain extent. Yeah, it's the language of all things to a certain extent. And that's what art is. Art is theological. I mean, last time I checked, I think the Bible is about the false theological claims of images, of idols. This is the thrust of the Old Testament. And of course, the New Testament response to that as the church matures is the true icon is the answer to the false idol. And this is Jean-Luc Marion's insights. And of course, it's not original to him, thankfully. Although he does such a fantastic job of communicating it.
And if theology really is what's at issue, I mean, that makes we have a lot of work to do in terms of a lot of there has been such a cultural divide between the arts and theology that kind of speaking intelligently in one or the other with the other in mind has been really difficult.
And it's a divide that really, I don't understand the place that it has in Christianity, because I think, maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong, I think that the revelation of God in its fullness is a form, the person of Jesus Christ, which is a visual phenomenon. It's not a book, right? That's the Islamic perspective, that here is the perfect Word of God. This is a famous trope. It's like the equivalent to the Quran in Christianity is not the Bible, but Jesus. And that's the difficulty and the reason it's difficult. I mean, we have to have those honest conversations with Muslims. Our primary revelation is Jesus. And that is the discovery of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, that they wrestle through. Right, okay. Well then, in some senses, the Byzantines elevate art to the level of theology, which is why they're so careful about it, sometimes not careful enough. And this has been what's going on for the last 2,000 years, because of course it started long before the Seventh Ecumenical Council. It started in the catacombs. And yet the disciplinary division of theology proper and art history are so late in the game, and they do no help to making sense of that. I like to throw around the term theography. Neologisms should be despised, but nevertheless it's helpful because graphein in Byzantine Greek means both to write and to draw. And so, yes, I think this is the way it works. And so art has always been a vessel of theological meaning. And that is not to endorse art as, I mean, we've got to get past the, art operates as the theological. That's really bad news sometimes, because sometimes it's disastrous theology, such as when God the Father is depicted as some bearded guy in the sky as he is in the Sistine Chapel. What a mistake! That's the God that atheists don't believe in. And
it's a God Christians don't believe in.
I sure hope we don't believe in that God. I don't, because he's not there.
Right.
It is a stealing the joy of the beatific vision and replacing it for something much less exciting. It's like opening your Christmas presents before the eschaton and realizing there's nothing within them, or it's really just a lump of coal. It's like, what? Is that what we're waiting for? No, we're waiting for the face of Jesus, who leads us higher up and further in to the Father, who he is the perfect image of. And that is an infinite horizon, as of course Christ is also. But we've made some huge mistakes because we have not acknowledged art's theological potential. Has the discipline of art history done a good job at that? I don't think so. Because again, it's born in such a late phase of European history that in some senses was not very good nurturing soil to think of it in this way. So we've got to recast the whole discipline and all the wonderful work that's been done in it to permit it to do that kind of labor, which it's always been doing. We're just finally catching up to that.
Right. And that would probably look something analogous to a social history of art, which would argue, I mean, analogous in the sense that a social history of art starts from the premise, look, if you're a human making something, whatever you make is an economic and political object. Similarly to maybe feminist art history, if you're a human making an object, that object has some sort of gender codes inscribed in it.
You just want the right ones.
Right. And maybe perhaps a theological history of art. It's not about it's not so much starts or stops about what it's depicting. It starts from the position that says, if you're a human making an object, it's a theological object. There's something inscribed in it about what it means to be human and what this world is. And that I think reframes, taking that approach reframes a lot of the way that we reapproach the table, so to speak.
Well, and it also, internally, it reframes every theological question. I mean, what would it look like to recast every major theological dispute with images in mind? That would be fascinating. Because I think what we would find is that the real work or the real damage was being done by the images all along. Meanwhile, theologians end their mutual discussion points and they've got it all figured out, and then the images are out there undoing all that good work. Or the images are fixing the problem, and meanwhile the theologians are just discussing this verbally and it's not doing any good work. So we've got a lot of work to do, and hopefully we will have a lot of people who come along and help us, because we need them.
That seems like a wonderful note to close on.
Yes, become an art historian.
Yes.
You out there. No.
You've got work to do. Matt, thank you so much for
Hey,
this
my
discussion.
pleasure.
Really been a pleasure.